Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I hope you're having a good day. My day has been a little bit weird. Weird in that my work email, I don't know if it's possessed, if it needs a good exorcism, or, well, obviously an IT exorcism. I'll get an email, I'll open it up, and I'll get 2 words. Hi, Sarah, doesn't really tell me anything about what that email is about. I'm not getting any of the rest of the email. And then some emails have been disappearing from my inbox. I know I saw them, and then they're not there. So either my email is gaslighting me or I've lost my mind, but I've double checked with a couple of the people that I thought I saw emails from, and they have said, yes, I did send that email and I will resend it. Hopefully that when they resend, it will actually come through at least long enough for the issue to be fixed so I can read more than 2 words of said email. I can read some of them on my phone, on the email app on my phone, so that helps a little bit, but it's not always the easiest thing to do, to reply to emails or to take care of emails on the phone, depending on what you need to do with them. Anyway, that's my weird day. My email is possessed, or possibly I'm going crazy. Either one is equally plausible. I am glad that you are joining me today, though, for another author interview. This is a returning author. Stephanie Kane was on the podcast about 1.5 years ago, September of 2019. If you want to check out her first episode, or even listen to this one and then check that one out, either way, good order, whatever order you want to do it. Her episode is number 189, and again, that was in September of 2019. So if you didn't hear the first time, or maybe you want a refresher, you should definitely listen to that one as well. Stephanie is back this time with a new book, but a nonfiction book. She writes murder mysteries. They often have an art component to them, and I've actually learned a lot about art from her for reading some of her books. But this one is different. This one is called Cold Case Story. It is nonfiction. It is actually a story from her own life. Let me go ahead and read you the description of the book, because I think it's fascinating. Here is the description from the back of the book. Cold Case Story is based on the brutal murder of a housewife in the Denver suburbs in 1973. A college student back then, Stephanie Kane was more than a witness to this terrible crime. For nearly 30 years, she remained silent. Then, in 2001, she tried to exorcise the crime by fictionalizing it in a mystery novel called Quiet Time. But instead of laying the murder to rest, Quiet Time brought it roaring back to life. Cold Case Story is about a family that fractured along the lines of a murder. It's about fiction colliding with a cold, hard crime, and the very personal story of how it feels to ping-pong between participant and observer, novelist and witness to one's own uneasy set of facts. In the end, all are punished, even the guilty. So, first of all, I'm just fascinated that obviously these stories happen, and there are people involved with them, but very rarely do I speak to people who are involved in cases like this or in stories like this. And the fact that Stephanie writes crime novels, and she was involved in this at a very young age during college. The woman who is in question, who was murdered, was in fact her mother-in-law. So she was very involved with that family in this case. And so just first of all, the fact that it happened. And then the fact that in 2001, almost 30 years later, she writes a fictionalized version of it that then causes the case to be reopened is kind of crazy, kind of fascinating, kind of wow. I wish I had better words, because all I can think of is fascinating and amazing. It really is. I mean, I can't quite imagine any of this. I'm totally projecting right now, but I'm just trying to think of how I would respond if any of this happened to me. Well, first of all, I'm not an author. Second of all, I mean, obviously this didn't happen to me, but how would I respond? And then the fact that there was a fictionalized version, and then the case was reopened, and it was all brought back up, and now she's written this memoir about the case and her involvement in it. I don't know. I'm going to let her talk more about it so that I can stop babbling at you, but I definitely think this is one that you should check out first if you are a fan already of Stephanie's other books, her fiction books, but also if you are a fan of true crime, this will definitely be something that you will want to check out, because it is true crime from a very specific perspective, and the results of that perspective obviously had long-reaching effects with the writing of that fictionalized version, with the writing of Quiet Time. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the episode over now to that interview. Again, the book is called Cold Case Story. The author is Stephanie Kane.
Hi, Stephanie. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Sarah.
I am happy to have you back. I enjoyed speaking with you the last time you were on. We are here to talk about your new book. It's called Cold Case Story. Before we get to the book, though, if you wouldn't mind sharing a bit about yourself for people who need a refresher or who maybe didn't hear the first interview.
Sure. As you know, I've had 3 careers. I've been a karate teacher, a lawyer, and a crime writer. I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, and I came to Colorado for college, and I ended up staying. After college, I owned and ran a karate studio, and then I went to law school. And basically, I started writing mysteries to escape practicing law, and also because I had a story I wanted to tell.
Yeah, I love the diversity, but I don't know, if there's diversity in your 3 careers and also a bit of continuity. I don't know, they seem like they kind of flow together, and also like they're sort of disparate. So that doesn't make any sense, but it does in my head.
Well, I wish you could tell me how they flow together, because they certainly seem like they were major departures at the time.
If I ever figure out my own brain, I'll let you know. So can you give an overview of Cold Case Story?
Sure. First, I should say it's unlike anything else I ever wrote. I mean, I've written 6 crime novels, and Cold Case Story is totally different from anything else I've ever written. And that's because, first of all, the story is true. Second, it's very personal to me. And third, it has spanned most of my life. So actually, if you're looking for a thread in my life, you would find it in Cold Case Story. It's the true story of the murder of Denver area housewife Betty Fry in 1973. And the reason the story is personal is because Betty was murdered on the eve of my marriage to her son. So back in 1973, on the day of the murder, I was one of the last people to speak to Betty. And I was also one of the first people to see her killer, because he came to the karate studio where my fiance was teaching that morning. The killer, who was Betty's husband, my future father-in-law, Dwayne, he was arrested for Betty's murder in 1973, but the charges were dropped right before the trial. So in 2001, I was married to their son for about 10 years. So this was like, another 20 years after our marriage ended. In 2001, I wrote my first mystery story. Remember, I mentioned a minute ago that I started writing mysteries because I had a story I wanted to tell. And the story I wanted to tell was the story of Betty's murder. I published it as Quiet Time, a totally fictionalized version. And I basically wrote it to exorcise my own ghosts, because I'd always had this sort of sense of guilt and fear that my upcoming wedding to her son had been the catalyst for what happened to her. Then, to make things even stranger, in 2005, a cold case was opened into Betty's murder after a witness, Wayne, my father-in-law's sister, saw an old run of a rerun of an interview of me on public TV being interviewed about quiet time. So she read the book, and that, in sort of a crisis of conscience, made her come forward with a confession that Dwayne had made to their mother. So suddenly a cold case was opened, and I was a prosecution witness. So basically, in a nutshell, Cold Case Story is the true story of Betty's murder. What happened the day she was killed, why the case against her killer fell apart in 1973, and what happened when it was reopened 30 years later. So that's what Cold Case Story is about.
Yeah, it really is fascinating. I mean, just the sequence of events that led to the reopening of the cold case, and how much, 30 years have gone by, and I don't know, it's really fascinating.
I'm going to pop in here so we can take our first break of the podcast also to say, oh, look, there's that word again, fascinating. I need a thesaurus, clearly, so that I can stop using the same word over and over in both interviews and podcasts. I apologize about that, but it really is fascinating. Let me just tell you. We're going to go take that break. When we come back, we'll be talking more about writing the fictionalized version of this story, Quiet Time. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Do you want to be healthier, yet you just don't know what to do? All these shows telling you this and that, but nothing seems to work. Well, listen close. Golden State Media Concepts has got something great for you. The Health and Wellness Podcast, dedicated to workout trends, healthy eating habits, diet, and everything about healthy living. Join us in our banters as we help you not just live life to the fullest, but live it to the healthiest.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with author Stephanie Kane about her new book, Cold Case Story. It's also, the story also involves a fictionalized version of the same story, that is Quiet Time, and we are about to talk a little bit more about the process of writing Quiet Time, which again is the fictionalized version of Cold Case Story.
You mentioned the novel Quiet Time, where you fictionalized the events. What was that process like for you to write the novel in the first place, many years after the event, and then kind of putting it down on paper, trying to tell that story, at least in a fictionalized version? How was that process for you?
Well, it was the first time I ever tried to write a book. Lawyers write a lot, at least in some of my practice, I had to write a lot, but learning the craft of fiction is a totally different kind of animal. And I basically wrote it because I'd never forgotten what happened. And in fact, it haunted me. All the questions surrounding it, why the charges against her husband were dropped, all those things just continue to haunt me. So in 2001, the only way I could write the story was because I had strong memories of the day Betty was killed, but I had access to very few facts. So if I could have written Cold Case Story, the true version, in 2001 instead of Quiet Time, I would have. I just didn't have the facts to do it. So the process of writing Quiet Time, it was sort of a laboratory. Two things were going on at once. I was trying to process the events through fiction, and it was also a laboratory for learning how to write fiction. And it went through like 20 drafts, and each draft taught me a lesson about how to construct characters, how to build a plot, and all of that. So it became sort of my personal laboratory for learning how to write a mystery. And Bantam acquired it and published it, and by then it was totally fictionalized. And Bantam required me to make a slew of other changes so that it could not be traced to, back to Betty's murder. And I was very happy to make those changes. And then comparing Quiet Time and Cold Case Story, I think one of the strongest comparisons is that both of them tell the story of a murder, but the stories are told from very different vantage points. Quiet Time is told from the perspective of a young woman who is trying to process a haunting event, because that's who I was when I wrote it, even though it was fiction. Cold Case Story, on the other hand, is kind of written from the perspective of a mature woman looking back who now had the benefit of all of the facts. So, they're similar, but they're very, very different. One thing that I think is interesting about Quiet Time is that although it was fiction and it was required to be even more heavily fictionalized by Bantam, somehow it retained enough truth to inspire a real witness to come forward. So, there's sort of an interesting interplay between fiction and fact throughout, the whole course of events.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sometimes the truth really is stranger than fiction, or I don't know if it's stranger in this case, but they're so intertwined between the actual story, then the novel, then the cold case, and then writing Cold Case Story. It's really fascinating.
Fiction can have power,
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned that it was based on a series of blog posts. Were those your blog posts? Just for clarification.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so, go ahead.
Well, after the cold case was over, I got the police files, witness interviews, transcripts, and reports from 1973 when there was the original prosecution, and 2005 when the cold case, came into being. And that was like thousands and thousands of pages with crime scene photos and audio tapes. But I still had questions. Betty was beaten to death in her garage. And, the record doesn't tell, what actually led up to that brutal explosion that day. And I was also, another thing that's missing from a record is always what the crime scene tells investigators that doesn't make it into the official file. So after I got all those records when the cold case was over, I spent the next 4 years interviewing witnesses on both sides of the family. I flew to Arizona to talk with the cop who had led the investigation in 1973. I picked the brains of forensic experts and cold case experts, to try to put Betty's story into a larger perspective. And once I had all of that, I wanted to write it out. And I chose a blog because I knew it would discipline me to write the story in very short, focused pieces that could go into all of the various aspects of it. Because I wanted to pull back from the brutal details of a true crime to look at the kind of social and psychological dynamics of a cold case. And some of the questions I had were, what happens when a killer walks? Well, what happens is the case never dies. I wanted to look at the dynamics of a family pitted against the justice system. What happens if a family, in this case, Betty's immediate survivors, what if they don't want to know the truth? And then I wanted to also look at how the justice system molds and reshapes the story of a crime, because in this case, the justice system actually failed Betty twice. So I wanted to use the actual record to set the record straight. And it seemed to me that if I did it in blog form, in short, very intensely focused bursts, that would be the most effective way to get at something a little deeper in this story than just a traditional true crime.
And then
so that's how I came up with the blog format.
Yeah, and then where in that process did you decide to turn those blog posts into a full-length book?
Well, I stopped because I was writing other books. I went back to writing, mystery stories. I stopped the blog short of the real ending, in the sense of what the whole experience had meant to me. And it felt incomplete to me. And when I went back to the blog, I also realized that maybe because I'm basically a novel writer, a full-length, narrative writer, it actually did have a beginning, a middle, and at least a technical ending. So it followed the dramatic arc of a book. And I thought it could be very effective pulled together as a book. And that, of course, required me to write, a true ending, which was, what the case had meant to me. So I did that, and that's how I pulled it together into a book. I also added some things from the nothing gory or too, revealing and intrusive. I added some crime scene photos to set the physical stage, and some personal photos to illustrate the story and bring it even more to life. So that's the differences between, that's how the blog turned into a book.
And it definitely, you can tell as you're reading through it that the chapters are concise, for chapters, that they're typical blog length. If you're reading a blog post, was there a lot of, did those blog posts pretty much make it intact into the book, or did you reformat anyway?
They actually did. I didn't edit them because when I wrote each of them, I tried to really get to the heart of what the focus of the post was about. So, I didn't go back and sand them down and, reshape them or anything, because each of them was pretty raw in terms of the emotion. And I wanted to retain that. I didn't want to lose that. And when you edit stuff, you tend to lose that.
Were the quotes at the beginning of each chapter also part of the blog post?
They were, and I'll tell you why I did that. As you know, it has sort of an unconventional format because each chapter kicks off with definitions or quotes, and I did that in the blog too. The quotes come from transcripts and police reports, and I used them to focus myself and to provide some context for what each chapter was about. I also wanted to make the story more immediate and dynamic and to try to bring it alive through the words of others. Some of the chapters, as you know, kick off with definitions. And that was meant to inject a bolt of objective reality because words and concepts have clear meanings. And so, when you're writing something as personal and subjective as the story of a crime that has basically shaped your entire adult life, it's really important to ground it, in words that have, common objective meanings. So it was meant to be sort of a grounding mechanism and a way to focus what was coming and also to bring it alive.
I'm not sure I've ever thought about the need for a grounding mechanism in this way before, but it makes absolute sense. As I said at the beginning, I've never been through anything like this experience that Stephanie describes in the book, so I can't speak to that element of it, but it does make absolute sense. We are going to go ahead and take our second break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be talking more about, obviously, Cold Case and Stephanie's experience as a lawyer, how that did or did not affect the writing of both Quiet Time and Cold Case Story. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with author Stephanie Kane about her book, Cold Case Story. Let's go ahead now and return to that interview.
So, you went through the events, obviously, in 1973, and then you became a lawyer. How did your experience as a lawyer kind of shape how you approached this process and writing the book and even doing the investigating and research that you did for the book and the blog?
Well, law teaches you, or at least it taught me, to be very analytical and thorough. So it was, and also to, sometimes you have to knock on doors. You've got, if something doesn't give you an answer, you can't just throw up your hands and say, well, I guess I'll never know. I mean, I think practicing law taught me a certain doggedness that was probably part of my personality anyway, but it gave me some sort of intellectual and psychological tools to try to go after the truth in as objective a way as I could. Being a lawyer did not serve me very well when I had to actually be on the witness stand in the cold case proceedings, because having been in the courtroom and having done some criminal defense work, I knew all the tricks, all the things that were going to be thrown at me. And so I think it was maybe harder being a lawyer to be sitting on the stand and having to process on so many different levels what was going on, because the most important thing is you want to tell the truth. You want to be as complete and accurate and unemotional as you can be to get the information out. Yet at the same time, that each question that you're being asked, has like a trap door, has some hidden thing, has some objective that is not eliciting the truth. So being a lawyer, came into my experience in many different ways throughout the whole process.
The book came out March 1st, is that correct?
That's right.
Yes. How has even before the book came out, how has the reaction from the family been? Because, you were married for 10 years, but you have not been part of that family since then, in that way. Has there been reaction? What was their reaction to the blog posts, to you researching, et cetera?
I have not. Well, in researching Cold Case Story, I interviewed elderly one of Betty's surviving sisters. By then, the witnesses were all in their 80s. I spent quite a bit of time with Betty's closest sister. She actually had 7. Came from a big farm family in Kansas. And I got a tremendous amount of background on who Betty was, and what some of the factors that led up to what happened. I also spent quite a bit of time interviewing Dwayne's sister, who had the tremendous courage to come forward with information about her brother's confession to their mother. And as a result, she had completely lost her relationship with Betty's children, because Betty's children all lined up behind their father in 1973 and in the cold case. I didn't have any contact with them during the cold case or afterwards. And at one point, the cold case detectives told me that they got a protective order forbidding Betty's and Dwayne's children from contacting me and also their elderly aunts, because they were so angry about what was going on. So I have not heard anything from the family members who were in my generation, but I did have quite a bit of contact with the family members who were in Betty's generation, who wanted, a prosecution to occur, and felt like, their sister had been failed by the system, at least in 1973, and they were very cooperative with the prosecution in the cold case. And to me, they're the heroes of this story, because they lost, they lost a lot by standing up for Betty. They lost their relationships with Betty's children, which had formerly been close relationships.
Mm-hmm. It really is an amazing story, and highlights a lot of different, family systems and those sorts of things. You were young. Obviously, you were a young bride-to-be in 1973. You didn't have the closest relationship with your mother-in-law then. She wasn't actually your mother-in-law yet, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
How has this process helped you to kind of reshape your image of Betty now that you're older, you've been married, you've been through a lot more? How has your opinion, because you didn't have the opportunity for that relationship to evolve, so how in your own mindset has that relationship evolved, or your opinion of Betty evolved?
Well, it evolved in a couple of ways. It's really interesting that you asked that, because, as you say, back then I was just, as a college kid, I wanted her to like me. I was entering her family. It was a very different family from my own. We had cultural differences. Betty did not approve of the marriage. So I was always, I was in the position of wanting her to like me, but, the differences were so huge, and then she was killed. So a couple of things happened. Through the course of the cold case and up to now, I developed a warm relationship with her closest sister, Jean, who was one of my sources for Cold Case Story. She filled me in a lot on growing up, what it was like for them growing up and all that. And she became I was able to sort of picture how my relationship with Betty might have evolved through the way my relationship with Jean evolved. So there was that. And there was also that, having so many decades pass and having had a second marriage, which is a happy marriage, it enabled me to step away from myself and the reactions I had back in 1973 and develop a real compassion for Betty and all of the aspects of her life, what she was going through in her own marriage, and, trying to come to terms with herself. And so I ended up feeling, very, very compassionate towards her. And one thing that really it made me feel close to her was, as I was writing the blog, I was looking through, what few tangible memories or souvenirs, you might say, artifacts of my first marriage. And I came across a cookbook that Betty had been given, I think, when she first got married. And it was more like a scrapbook for recipes than it was a cookbook. It was designed to be, a young wife's scrapbook of how she enters a marriage. It was called My Favorite Recipes. And it had Betty's handwritten notes in it. It had note cards written in peacock blue ink. And it just gave me such a snapshot of what she had entered her marriage with, all the dreams and all the hopes, about the family she wanted to build. And when I got to know Jean, I gave her that, because it was more appropriate that she have it than that I did, and she was very moved by that, because it brought her sister to life at a certain point in her life that was a very tender point, much like the stage that I was at when I entered her family. So those things all kind of rounded out Betty for me as a real human being. And that's something that I hope that readers take away from it. The human aspects of this story, that murder doesn't happen in a vacuum, and it has a lasting impact. Betty was a real woman whose death rippled through a family system and larger systems, like a stone in a pond. And I want people to take that away from the story. Another thing I want people to take away from the story is that the justice system is not a shapeless monolith. It is comprised of humans who are fallible. They make decisions all the time, and some of those decisions are good ones, and some of them are bad ones, and some are made for good reasons, and some are made for the wrong reasons, for personal reasons. And so for me, the whole story is just a very, very human story. And Betty, of course, is at the heart of it.
Pardon the interruption as I jump in here so we can take our last break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be talking a little bit more about the cathartic process of writing not only Quiet Time, but also a cold case story. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Golden State Media Concepts social media podcast. Time to hashtag everything. We talk about all the fun, crazy stories on social media, from Instagram to Facebook, Twitter to Tumblr, or probably even Friendster. Join us each week as we explore the quirky side of social media. It's the Golden State Media Concepts social media podcast.
It's simple, such a sad song. The one that we rely on to get us.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Stephanie Kane. Again, we are talking her books, Quiet Time and Cold Case Story.
You mentioned that you wrote Quiet Time as a bit of a cathartic experience, trying to process through some of your own emotions about the case. Do you feel like Cold Case Story has given you that closure or that cathartic processing that you were hoping for?
Well, the catharsis came at various stages. When I was a witness in the cold case, which was certainly nothing I would have ever guessed would happen in a million years, I had to come to terms with what I had done to fictionalize her case in Quiet Time. And, I had to face these people I had fictionalized, I'd made into, villains or whatever. I had to face them as human beings, in a courtroom. So that was, very cathartic and triggering. So there was catharsis and triggers throughout. But, one really cathartic and triggering aspect of writing Cold Case Story, which, again, I couldn't have predicted, was coming up with the ending. You know, when you're writing fiction, a writer comes up with an ending to satisfy the reader's expectations or the writer's needs, or both. Like in a crime story, you know, the killer gets caught, justice prevails, things come out right. But in writing Cold Case Story, this was after I had ended the blog, but the story still, I had stopped short of writing what it really meant to me. When I wrote the ending of Cold Case Story, which is the last 5 or 6 very short chapters, it was unexpectedly painful because I had to face what the whole experience meant to me. And it was triggering and cathartic because it forced me to accept who I was in 1973 and things I had done or not done, and what that means for the person I am now. And that was pretty heavy. But I guess that's the ultimate catharsis, that the whole story and experience produced.
Yeah, I can only imagine the the emotions that you had to have gone through, and just the process of not the process of processing, the process of remembering and kind of figuring things out from your current standpoint. It had to have been a lot of emotional work.
And judging yourself, you know, and figuring out how that person became the person you are now, and what it means about the person you are now, that you were the person you were then, you know. You know.
But to have this happen at such a young age, it has to have, you know, made an impact on the person that you are now, obviously. And even if the cold case hadn't happened, something this significant at a young age, right before your marriage, you know, it would affect how you lived your life beyond that point.
Yeah, well, you know, it's all about coming to terms with who you are, and, you know, using what you learn about that to shape who you are going forward.
Sure. Yeah.
And this just happened to be the vehicle for me to do it.
Right.
You know.
Right. Well, I mean, hey, at least you had a vehicle and a way to work through that. That's great. What are you working on now?
Well, I have gone back to my art conservator mystery series, starring paintings conservator Lily Sparks, which I think we talked about the last time I was on your show.
Yes, we did.
And each mystery is based on or inspired by a real artist. So this third installment is called Object Lessons, and it's kind of a modern take on Francis Glessner Lee's 1940s crime scene dioramas. So for people who don't know who Francis Glessner Lee was, which is probably like 99.999% of the people on the earth, Francis Glessner Lee was a Chicago heiress who pioneered. She was the first woman to do this. She created crime scene dioramas, which are basically little dollhouses, except the dolls in them are dead. And she built them. She devised this process, and she built them. She built about 20 of them, which are still in existence today. And there was a museum exhibit of them a year or two ago in Washington. They're beautifully accomplished dollhouses. And what they do is they document a crime scene. And Francis Glessner Lee devised them as a way to teach homicide detectives how to investigate a crime scene. So they were training tools. And they're just absolutely marvelous dioramas. They're like I think they're 1 inch to a foot scale, and they're just perfect. You know, the window blinds in her dioramas work, and you know the little coffee machine has coffee grounds in it, and she was just very obsessive about that. So the story takes place in Denver, as all my mysteries do. The Denver Police Department gets a Department of Justice grant to train investigators through custom-made crime scene dioramas. And there's a couple in Washington who design these dioramas, and they go around the country and they come to Denver. And when they come to Denver with their crime scene dioramas, bigger versions of those crimes start occurring. So the question that Object Lessons addresses is, can little crimes inspire big ones? And that's what that book is about. It's coming out this fall.
One thing that I love about that series of yours is that I have never heard of, I'm one of those people that had never heard of Frances Glessner Lee, and so I just Googled her right now as we're talking, and I did the same thing when I was reading your first book in the series. I Googled a lot of the artwork, and so it opens me up to learning a little bit more about art that, that I makes me look closer at art that I maybe have seen, maybe have not, and so not only do you tell a good story, it's an interesting mystery to figure out, but I also learn about art. So thanks.
Well, I'm glad. And, part of the motivation for me to write these things is to learn something too. Because if I'm not learning as I'm writing, it just can't be dynamic, So part of what you're picking up on is the dynamism of the excitement of me, the writer, learning about it too.
Yeah, absolutely. What have you been reading when you have time to read?
Well, when I write fiction, I'm sure this is going to be very disappointing, but when I write fiction, I stick to nonfiction because I get so immersed in the story that research is all that I want to do. So while I was writing Object Lessons, I read this great biography of Frances Glessner Lee called The Nutshell Studies of Unexplained Death. And then I also read this wonderful nonfiction book called In Miniature by Simon Garfield. And he looks at what the power of, what the power and the attraction of miniature objects is. If you think about a train set, there's something fascinating about a tiny little train set that is traveling through this tiny little constructed town and village. And, he explores the kind of the psychological dynamics of that. So basically when I write fiction, I stick to nonfiction.
I'm now rethinking my brother's whole Victorian Christmas village. I'm wondering what it means on a deeper level.
Oh, you should definitely read In Miniature. It's a fantastic book. And of course, it's a very small book. It's a delightfully small book.
I love that.
It's a wonderful book.
All right, thank you. Stephanie, I know you have a website, so if you can tell people where to find your website and where any social media that they can interact with you on.
I'm thrilled to tell you because I love interacting with readers. My website is writerkane.com, and that's Kane with a K, Kane. You can also find me on the Stephanie Kane Amazon Author Central page, and I'm on Facebook at Author Stephanie Kane. And I love interacting, and I always answer emails.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Do you put out a newsletter at all, an author newsletter?
Only when I have like a new book coming out, because I just hate to bombard people with stuff.
Sure. Yep. We get a lot of email in the world.
Yeah.
Well, we have talked about a few different things today, but is there anything that we haven't covered, especially in terms of Cold Case Story, that you really wanted to bring up during this interview?
Well, there is something, and that's advice for aspiring authors, because Cold Case Story has really taught me a lot. And there's a couple of pieces of advice. They're related to each other. The first is that if you're writing fiction or nonfiction, you should always strive to be as honest as true as you can in telling your story, not just because that connects with readers, but because it can have surprising results, and what I'm thinking of is that a lot of the truth got pounded out of Quiet Time because it was meant to be fiction, but something in that survived that reached somebody years later when they were watching an old rerun in the middle of the night, and it resulted in a cold case. And I think if it had been, if that truth, whatever that emotional truth was that survived, if that had somehow been pounded out of it, or if it had never been there, it wouldn't have touched the person who came forward. And then the other piece of advice, obviously, is write what you care about, the story you're meant to tell. You might have to put it away in a drawer and revisit it from time to time, and in different ways, like in fiction, in a blog, while you're learning the craft. But I think writers need to have faith that no matter how long it takes, they'll find the right way to tell that story. And everybody has that story in them. And that's the story they should try to tell, however long it takes.
Yeah, actually, that just makes me think of how this story has evolved for you from writing a fictionalized version to then writing the blog to then turning that blog into a book. That has to have been an interesting process and an interesting process for you as not only as a person who experienced all of this, but who then put it into words, and how that process worked for you as a writer.
Well, each time I challenged myself to do it in a different way, because I kept trying to find the best way to tell it. So I learned every time, and I really, what I learned from that blog was the power of compression. Going deep, why not, instead of going wide. And with Cold Case Story, I forced myself to really write the ending, the true, deepest ending, which was painful to do, but I owed it to anybody who was reading the book. So I kept learning,
which is the most important thing, I think. I want to thank you so much for joining me again on the podcast. I have really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks a million for having me, Sarah.
Thank you once again to Stephanie for joining me for a second time on the podcast, this time to talk about her new book, Cold Case Story. As a quick side note, while we were talking and she was talking about the book that she was reading about the miniatures, the crime scene miniatures, I looked that up and looked at some of the pictures, and the detail is amazing and it's pretty cool. So that may be a book you want to check out if that's something that you are interested in. I know I would love to read it. I'll add it to my TBR. We'll see if it if it gets read anytime soon. But the pictures are really cool. So if you have a few minutes and you just want to look up the pictures, go ahead and do that and see the incredible detail that went into those crime scene dioramas. But also, you should definitely check out Stephanie's books, especially this new one, Cold Case Story, if you are a fan of true crime, or if you're already, like I said earlier, a fan of Stephanie's work. Maybe you've already read Quiet Time. You should read Cold Case Story, see the differences, see where fiction and nonfiction collide or depart. And then Stephanie's other books, of course, she spoke about them a little bit in the podcast, but there are a lot to choose from. So if you are not a reader of Stephanie Kane, you should definitely go check her out on her website or Amazon or your independent bookstore, wherever you buy books, wherever you look into books. Definitely go check that out. Thank you, as always, to you, my listeners. You know I so very much appreciate you. If you are a fan of this podcast, please do me the favor of a couple of things. If you're not already following me on social media, well, the podcast on social media, you don't need to follow me. I'm boring. Follow the podcast on social media. GSMC Book Review is on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I love hearing from listeners, so feel free to contact me. That would be awesome. Also, if you haven't done so already and you would like to help this podcast reach book lovers such as yourself, please do leave us a review on whatever podcast platform you are listening on. Also, like, subscribe, do all those wonderful things. I know I say it every week, but it really does help get this podcast out to more listeners. And who doesn't want to learn more about books? So we want more listeners to find out about fun authors that they can check out. Speaking of fun authors and fun author interviews, next episode, I will be speaking to author Nancy Burke about her new book, Only the Women Are Burning. If that title doesn't intrigue you, I don't know what will. I'll make you wait until the episode, of course, to give you the full description of the book, but here is a quote on the back of the book from Sheila Kohler, author of Cracks, Crossways, and the memoir Once We Were Sisters. She writes, a suspenseful, vivid, and convincing portrayal of the often precarious position of women in the world. There you go. Only the Women Are Burning by Nancy Burke. That is the book that we will be speaking about and the author that I will be speaking to on the next episode. So please join me for that. In the meantime, hope you're having a wonderful day. Hope whatever you're doing, you already are reading or you will soon be reading, and you will take lots and lots of time to find yourself getting lost in a good book. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.